They have closed the gap, probably cut it just about. Oh my gosh, down the hill, Doug Henry. A major crash at the bottom of this jump, and Doug flips off the goggles.
I can't believe what I just saw.
That was unbelievable.
It was the first day of summer in 1995, taco night at the Patio and Pub in Clio, Michigan. And Jason Colby told the rest of the teenagers at the table that Doug Henry had tried to jump over the power lines at the previous weekend's pro motocross in Budds Creek. The story didn't make any sense, and the tale may have gotten taller and more embellished. I can't really remember. Colby may have mentioned that Henry was dead. We didn't get the actual truth for another week when Cycle News finally showed up. This is the story of what really happened on June 18, 1995, and why Budds Creek MX Park has an obstacle named Henry Hill. For video and images of the crash, find this story at wewentfast.com. Search 2.8 seconds. And support the brand that goes the extra mile to tell you good stories. Shop.wewentfast.com has shirts, hats, and artwork. That's shop.wewentfast.com. And now, Doug Henry's 2.8 seconds to legend. The story behind how small errors, fatigue, pride, determination, and a wardrobe issue caused Doug Henry to take the most notorious flight in motocross history. Everybody responded differently to what happened. Some of the sun-baked spectators processed it slowly. Others reacted immediately, but were clearly unsure what exactly they should do. One shirtless man, holding a koozie-wrapped can in his left hand, ran from outside of the camera's view, hurdled the fence steeplechase style, and just stood near the rider's feet. Some spectators stood there, slumped over the barrier, motionless. Others slowly raised their disposable cameras to their eyes and snapped photos. Many pointed back up the hill as if they were still trying to convince themselves of what they just saw and from where it came. The witnesses. Stacy Henry saw it happen from the back of a Honda box van. She watched the race but wanted relief from the oppressive Father's Day sun and humidity that blanketed southern Maryland. She had a head-on angle, but was far enough away that she said to herself, "What kind of line was that?" A couple of seconds passed, and she wondered why her husband hadn't gotten up yet. Doug always bounced right back up. Then John Dowd's wife, Trish, came over and told Stacy to get down to the track. Jeremy McGrath didn't understand why he heard Doug Henry's engine accelerating through the braking bumps. McGrath had moved slightly to his right to avoid the uphill chatters and thought if he ran it in deep on his teammate, he could gain a few tenths of a second. He looked to his left and saw Henry hanging off the back of his bike and then floating away like a Nordic ski jumper. McGrath let up. Henry gained velocity and height by the time McGrath started descending from his own jump. "I thought he was dead," McGrath says. Davey Coombs turned around just in time to see something fall out of the sky and hear what he called a sickening thud, the sound of metal breaking and a bomb hitting but not going off. He was shooting photos and writing for Cycle News. He and Motocross Action's Chris Holtner were loading film into their cameras. They looked at each other and raced toward the fence. Jonathan Beasley had been awake for 2 days preparing his racetrack for this day, the 4th round of the Pro Motocross Championship. He faced the course and specifically remembers talking with someone who stood at his own towering height, 6'4". Chatter from his two-way radio filled the other ear. He saw the whole thing and still calls it one of the scariest moments of his life. The radio noise died. Beasley hopped on his ATV and took off. Doug was probably 70 feet in the air at the height of that jump, Beasley says. It was just sad seeing how he fell like a rock. Brian Austin was racing in the moto, but a lap down. The leader, Mike Larocco, had just passed, and Austin knew that second and third place would soon follow. Then he heard something that wasn't quite normal, and he looked over his right shoulder. Nothing. Then he looked up, way up, and saw another rider in the air at an obscenely abnormal height. Austin was 10 to 15 feet away from where Doug Henry landed, and the most vivid and disturbing memory was that he actually felt the ground shake. I could feel it, hear it, and taste how much compressive force happened, Austin says. Shelton Hines, a lanky construction worker from Columbia, Maryland, reached Henry's side first, within 10 seconds of him landing. Hines jumped the fence and in long strides walked to Henry and picked up the discarded purple Scott goggles. It looked like his eyes were rolling into the back of his head, Hines says. It was pretty bad. He remembers being asked for water and then dropping the goggles and attempting to remove Henry's helmet. Within seconds, an EMT shooed Hines away. He and 3 other random spectators, who all ran in from different directions, scattered. Understanding what happened.
See if we can figure out what happened. Looks like he falls to the rear of the bike and just grabbed a handful of throttle right there. Look at him high in the air.
And then the compression as he lands, flips over, and rolls, and that absorbs some of the impact that landed.
I've been around motocross my whole life, and I've never seen anything quite like that.
An obvious statement. Doug Henry's June 18, 1995 crash at Budds Creek Motocross Park in Mechanicsville, Maryland, is one of the most infamous and bizarre motorcycle wrecks of all time. But to merely describe it as a crash is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened. It was more like a flight than a plummet. In trying to learn why this incident will forever be memorable, first understand that Henry did something that had no possibility of yielding a benefit. If he had landed it, was not an option. He didn't crash attempting a unique jump combination, or endo, or high side, or swap out of control. He sent himself into the atmosphere, seemingly on purpose. For everyone who witnessed the crash, it was completely nonsensical. For most of the spectators, Henry had come from completely out of view to suddenly 5 to 7 stories in the air. People were forced to make their own conclusions. In 1995, there was no live TV at motocross races, or even a TV truck from where team and race officials could get answers. Cameras captured footage on physical tape that had to be edited together. ESPN aired the footage a week, sometimes 2 weeks, later. In Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, which examines the factors that lead to high levels of success, one chapter makes an argument that plane crashes do not happen as the result of a single catastrophic cause. Instead, Gladwell says plane crashes are a subtle process that begins slowly and gradually overtake the pilots until the plane ends up in an unredeemable crisis. Doug Henry, the only person who truly knows what happened that day, would agree. From small mistakes to fatigue, pride, determination, a wardrobe issue, and even bike setup, it was a series of factors that led him to be dropped from the sky. Doug Henry versus Jeremy McGrath. Henry battled McGrath for second place. They were halfway through the second to last lap of Moto 1, and the defending series champion Larocco was less than 2 seconds ahead of them. In a rutted left-hand corner in a secluded area of the course, Henry took the inside, McGrath the outside line. McGrath saw Henry make a mistake in the corner and gained a little time. Then Henry, on his number 4 Honda CR250R, cased the downhill double out of the corner and nearly landed on an automobile tire that served as a crude track barrier. McGrath downsided the double cleanly and closed more distance on his Honda teammate. The riders then raced to the bottom of a valley before climbing another steep hill. Henry hit a bump with a square edge. The suspension compressed and his body position suddenly shifted so far back his butt patch rubbed the stickers off his rear fender. His feet also hung off the backs of the foot pegs. Meanwhile, McGrath was in a smoother line and in attack mode, elbows out, head over the bars. Henry was understandably fatiguing. Arm pump had affected his grip, and the temperature that day reached 89 degrees. But he couldn't relent. He battled with not only his teammate, but the championship points leader. Henry had won the previous round at High Point Raceway a few weeks earlier, his first career win in the premier class of pro motocross. Beating McGrath meant taking over the points lead. Hanging off the back of the bike while simultaneously rolling on the throttle with his fingertips, Henry's last resort was to get his foot on the rear brake to slow himself down. John Dowd's boot. If only he had not been wearing John Dowd's right boot that day. Henry tweaked his ankle in practice 2 days prior, and it hurt so badly that he borrowed a size 11 boot from his friend Dowd. It was one size bigger than he normally wore, which he needed to accommodate for his swelling ankle. And in addition to that, Henry had asked Honda tech Cliff White to fit a steel plate to the insole. It was the flexing of the boot's sole that caused him the most pain, and the plate eliminated that flex, including this moment when he really needed it to reach the brake lever. The last thing working against Henry was his own bike setup. In normal conditions, his CR250 was perfect for his riding style, a shorter front end with more weight bias and a looser rear shock. Tall and lean, Henry didn't like too much rebound in the shock. According to Dave Arnold, Honda's team manager in the 1980s and early to mid-1990s, the looser damping, lesser rebound, and amount of speed and torque a factory Honda could produce was lethal in that specific moment on that specific track obstacle. A different bike setup wouldn't have saved Henry from flight, but he may not have flown as high or as far. Everything happened in reverse for Doug at that moment, Arnold says. Everything happened that you didn't want to happen. The one thing that did go correctly for Henry was his decision to stay on the bike. He debated letting go upon takeoff. Once the decision to stay on the bike was made, he then thought maybe he could make it to the retention pond in the infield. I thought that would be a soft landing, not realizing that I was only a quarter of the way there, Henry says. I decided to get control of the bike and just land it and see what happens. I remember going off that jump in the air, and it was like one of those dreams. It wasn't real. I've always had dreams where I'm riding and I land and I wake up. It really felt like that. It was really just a dream. 2.8 seconds to legend. But it wasn't a dream. Once airborne, he pulled his body weight forward. With the front end high, he looked like Evel Knievel jumping the fountains at Caesar's Palace. After 2.8 seconds of airtime, Henry's rear wheel touched down first, about 20 feet shy of reaching the corner at the bottom of the hill. To this day, Larocco claims that he saw Henry's shadow and thought to himself, "What is he doing?" The sprinklers at Budds Creek are spaced 60 feet apart, and Henry came down next to the third one from the top. He traveled more than 120 feet downhill, nearly to the flat bottom. Beasley has since had the land surveyed and discovered that the vertical height of that track obstacle is 112 feet. When the front wheel slapped to the ground, Henry's body violently slammed into the seat. His torso folded completely in half, and his head drilled into the front end. His right arm blew off the handlebar and got tossed out and behind him as if winding up for a pitch. The force of the impact was so great on the bike that the load transferred from the suspension and into the bolts that held the shock into the frame. Cliff White said those bolts bent and had to be beaten loose from the frame. Surprisingly, the wheels were still intact. When the suspension rebounded, Henry's body sprang over the front end and he did a forward somersault with the motorcycle. It was like he was wrestling his bike to the ground. His hands were tangled in the flailing machine, which knocked him in the head. When he finally stopped rolling, he immediately took off his goggles with his left hand, paused, evaluated himself, realized that he could move his legs and feet, and then tried to roll onto his back. A sharp pain sent him back to his side. Stacy's intuition saves Doug's career. His spine bent so far on impact that his L1 vertebra burst, causing spinal cord compression. Doctors later said that the fact that he retained full movement in his legs was miraculous. At the first hospital, when Stacy Henry asked a doctor to explain the surgery they were going to perform, he said, "You wouldn't understand." She handed him a piece of paper and a pen and asked him to draw it. He drew a crude stick figure that didn't explain much. "He's young. He can find another job," Stacy remembers a second doctor telling her. She knew she had to get Doug out of that hospital. How he dismissed all the hours and heart this guy had. "I thought, he has no clue what this guy's been through," she says. "He thinks it's just a backyard accident." Stacy moved her husband to George Washington University, where a young neurosurgeon named Charles Rydell partnered with an orthopedic surgeon to clean up the bone fragments that lay dangerously close to the spinal column. Then they rebuilt Henry's L1, a new procedure at the time. In place of that vertebra, we then placed a titanium mesh cage, which we filled with grafted bone so it would grow and replace what used to be there, Dr. Rydell says. Had the two doctors at the first hospital been more compassionate and empathetic, Stacy today believes that she would have allowed them to perform a more traditional and safer operation. Rods would have fused 6 or 7 vertebrae together. Henry's career as a professional motocross racer would have ended in 1995. The legend of Doug Henry. As emergency responders knelt near Henry's head in the Budds Creek dirt, trying to ascertain the location of his pain, the rider struggled to remove his gloves. He pulled off his left fox pawtector, which revealed a gold wedding band. Henry didn't remove the ring, even while racing. Exhausted, he stopped moving and rested in the fetal position while the EMTs and Honda staff worked to stabilize him. When a transport vehicle wasn't able to get into the valley to drive Henry up to the ambulance, 4 EMTs and 2 Honda team members picked up the stretcher. With his legs and torso taped down, his neck in a brace, his jersey cut off, and his mouth smothered with an oxygen mask, they carried him right back up the very hill that dropped him from the sky, now called Henry Hill. Maybe it was at his request. Maybe he wrestled them loose. But Doug Henry's arms were free. When he raised his 2 bare arms into the air and held a double thumbs up, the swelling crowd at the fences knew they were witnessing a legend. If you love this story, go find episode 20, Doug Henry and the Dam, a story about Doug's roots as a rider. I wanted to know how Doug Henry became Doug Henry, the scrappy kid from New England who worked 2 jobs while trying to make it as an athlete. And support us by buying swag from shop.wewentfast.com. That's shop.wewentfast.com. Leave a 5-star rating, tell a friend, and join our mailing list at wewentfast.com/subscribe.